The body of the ship had been dead for days. Rail could tell by the way the metal had cooled, not the sharp cold of a fresh hull breach, but the deep, settled cold of something that had simply stopped and been forgotten. The hauler was a mid-size cargo runner, the kind that moved between the outer rim stations and the black market drop points that the Galactic Conclave pretended did not exist. It was drifting now, slow and sideways, caught in the lazy pull of a gas giant's outer ring. Nobody had reported it. Nobody was coming for it. That was why Rail was here. He brought the dumb luck in close and cut his forward thrusters. The salvage hauler was not a pretty ship. It had dents in 3 separate hull sections, a docking arm that only worked if you hit it twice with a wrench before engaging, and a navigation console held together in one corner with a metal clamp he had never gotten around to replacing. But it flew, and it found things, and for a man who worked alone in the outer rim of the Vorath system, that was enough. Rail suited up, ran his oxygen check, and crossed over on the magnetic line. The dead hauler's hull was scorched in long streaks, not from an explosion, from something burning outward. Whatever had been inside had been set on fire from within, and someone had done it in a hurry. He could see the tool marks on the outer cargo hatches, the kind left when you crack a lock with a cutter instead of a key. Poachers. He had seen the work before, back in his ranger days. Get in, take what you came for, burn the rest, leave. He moved through the outer corridor, with his light cutting the dark ahead of him. The main cargo bay had been emptied and scorched. Cargo nets hung from the ceiling in burned rags. Whatever had been stored here was gone. He scanned the floor out of habit. Scales. He saw 2 or 3 large dark scales near the far wall, each one the size of his palm, edges jagged where they had been pulled free rather than shed naturally. His stomach dropped a little. He knew what that meant. He had read enough black market manifests in his ranger years to know exactly what those scales were worth, and what kind of creature they came from. Drakvine. He stood very still for a moment. Then he heard it. It was faint, so faint that he almost convinced himself it was a hull stress sound, the kind of groaning and shifting that dead ships made as they cooled. But it came again, and it was not metal. It was something alive, small and exhausted and afraid, but alive. He followed it through the inner corridor, past a sealed door he had to cut through, past what had been the ship's small medical bay and was now just a burned room with a melted table. He followed it to the very last sealed compartment at the rear of the ship, a thermal emergency bay, the kind of small sealed room designed to hold body heat in a vacuum if life support failed. The door was locked from the inside. He cut it. Inside there was a thermal pod, a standard emergency capsule, the kind rated for 48 hours of heat retention. Its power indicator was blinking red. It had maybe 10 minutes left. And curled inside it, pressed together, were 2 creatures he had never expected to see in his life. They were small, no larger than medium-sized dogs, though he knew they would not stay that size. Their scales were dark, patchy with stress, the color gone dull the way scales went when a creature was cold and sick and frightened. They had wings folded tight against their bodies and small ridged heads tucked down. They were trembling. And they were crying, a sound that was not quite like any animal sound he had ever heard, somewhere between a high whistle and a low keen, the kind of sound that went right through a person's chest without asking permission. He stood in the doorway of that thermal pod and looked at them. On the floor beside the pod was a large shape under burned covering. He did not lift the covering all the way. He saw enough. An adult Drakvane female, her scales stripped in long sections. She had not survived. But before she died, she had sealed her young into the pod, set the heat to maximum, and locked the door from inside by reaching through the manual release and pulling it shut. She had bought them time. She had bought them exactly this much time. Rail looked at the 2 hatchlings. One of them had lifted its head and was looking at him with amber eyes that were too large for its face and full of something he could not name. The other one, smaller, snapped at the air in his direction, not in real aggression, just in the automatic way of something very young and very scared. He checked his oxygen gauge. He checked the pod's power indicator. He looked back at the burned corridor behind him. He had a decision to make, and he knew it. Drakvane were listed as legally extinct by the Galactic Conclave, Possessing them was a violation of 3 separate conclave statutes. The poachers who had killed their mother were probably already 3 systems away. Reporting this would mean conclave inspectors, conclave questions, and conclave decisions about what to do with the 2 surviving hatchlings, and he knew exactly what those decisions would look like. Clean, quiet, final. He did not think about it for very long. He unclipped the carry harness from his suit, folded it out to its full size, and climbed into the pod. The smaller one snapped at his glove. He let it. The larger one watched him with those amber eyes and did not move away when he reached in. He lifted them both, one at a time, secured them against his chest with the harness, and felt them shaking through the layers of his suit. He went back to the dumb luck the way he had come, across the magnetic line, through his own airlock, into the warmth of his ship. He set them down on the floor of the cargo hold, which was the largest open space he had, and got the emergency heat blankets from the storage cabinet and laid them down. He got water. He got the food rations he had been saving for the week, broke them open, and set them out. The smaller hatchling ate immediately, fast, aggressive, no hesitation. The larger one watched Rail first, then it ate. He sat on a crate and looked at them for a long time. He had not asked for this. He had come out here for salvage metal and maybe some cargo containers he could strip and sell at the Gorath station. He had not come out here for 2 infant dragons whose species the entire galaxy had agreed to let die quietly. But they were crying when he found them, and he had stopped. He pulled up the navigation console and set a course for the deep outer rim, away from the conclave lanes, away from the inspection corridors, away from anything official. He did not file a salvage report for the dead hauler. He left it drifting. As the dumb luck accelerated away into the dark, he looked back at the 2 hatchlings settling into the heat blankets. The smaller one was already asleep. The larger one was still watching him. He had no plan. He had no idea what came next. He had a salvage hauler, 1 week of rations, and 2 creatures that the Galactic Conclave had decided did not need to exist anymore. He figured he would think of something. He usually did. 3 months is a long time to keep a secret in a small ship. The dumb luck had 2 rooms that counted as livable, the cockpit and the cargo hold. Rail slept in the cockpit on a pull-out bunk that was 2 inches too short for him. He ate at the navigation console. He did his repairs in the cargo hold, which now also served as the sleeping quarters, feeding area, and general territory of 2 growing Drakvine hatchlings who were getting less small every single week. The smaller one, the one that had snapped at his glove on the first day, had not stopped being aggressive. It bit everything. It bit the cargo netting. It bit the empty ration containers. It bit Rail's boot twice before he learned to walk with a deliberate heavy step so it could hear him coming. He had started calling it Thorn, not because he planned to give it a name, but because that was what it felt like every time it grabbed his hand to examine it. The larger one was different, quieter. It did not bite or knock things over. It watched. It followed Rail from room to room with those steady amber eyes and sat near whatever he was doing, not in the way, just present. He had started calling it Sable because of its scales, which were very dark, almost black, and which had begun to regain their sheen over the past few weeks as the hatchlings ate properly and stayed warm. He had done his research in the first week. He knew they would keep growing. He knew, roughly, what they would eventually become. He knew their species had once been the most feared in the known galaxy, not because they were cruel, but because they were powerful in a way that made the word powerful seem insufficient. He also knew that the last confirmed adult Drakvine had been killed 230 years ago, and that the Galactic Conclave had quietly reclassified the species as extinct 12 years after that, which made the whole thing very clean on paper. He did not think about the future too hard. He focused on keeping them fed and warm and hidden. Hiding them was technically easier than he expected because the Conclave did not expect to find them. Inspectors scanned for weapons, illegal cargo, and the standard list of contraband species. Drakvine were not on the active contraband list. They were on the extinct list. You did not scan for things that did not exist anymore. This was a gap in the system, and Rail used it the way he used most gaps, quietly, without announcing himself. He modified the cargo hold's heat signature shielding, originally installed to protect temperature-sensitive salvage, and used it to mask the biological heat output of the two hatchlings during scans. He kept his salvage runs to routes where conclave presence was light. He paid his docking fees on time and filed clean manifests. He was the most boring ship in the Outer Rim, on paper. For 3 months, it worked. Then the Keth Moral registry ship showed up. He was running a standard approach into the Gorath fuel station when the registry vessel dropped out of a relay jump point and positioned itself across his lane. It was not a warship. It was a conclave inspection vessel, mid-class, the kind staffed by bureaucrats with scanning equipment and the authority to detain any ship they chose for any reason they considered sufficient. Its hull markings were those of the Vorin Administrative Division, which handled Outer Rim compliance. The comm opened without a greeting. Salvage vessel Dumb Luck, this is the Keth Moral Conclave Registry Division. You are directed to reduce speed, transmit full cargo manifest, and prepare for biological inspection. Compliance is mandatory under Conclave Outer Rim Statute 41. Rail reduced speed. He transmitted his manifest, the one that listed salvage metal, stripped components, and 1 crate of used navigation parts. He did not prepare for biological inspection. He opened the comm back. Keth Moral, this is Dumb Luck. Receiving your directive. I want to note that under Salvage Operator Clause 9 of Outer Rim Statute 41, I am entitled to a 48-hour manifest review period before any physical inspection, given that I am a single operator vessel with no legal representation on board. I am invoking that clause now. Silence for a moment. Then, this vessel operates under Administrator Solus of the Vorin Division. Your clause request is noted and is under review. Stand by. Rail stood by. He used the time to move Thorn and Sable deeper into the shielded section of the cargo hold, get the heat barriers fully up, and give Thorn a piece of dried food to keep it occupied. He gave Sable a look that he knew was ridiculous. You could not explain a situation to a 3-month-old dragon, but Sable seemed to understand tone, and his tone said be still, and Sable was still. Administrator Solus came on the comm himself 20 minutes later. His voice was the voice of a man who had been in administration for a very long time and found most things faintly irritating. Salvage Operator, your clause request has been reviewed. It is technically valid. However, I want to be clear that this is a procedural delay, not a resolution. We have detected anomalous biosignatures from your vessel on 2 separate scans. The signatures are faint and partially masked, which itself is a flag. You will be subject to full inspection within 48 hours. Understood, Rail said. I appreciate the Conclave's thoroughness. He said it without any expression in his voice at all. He spent the next 48 hours moving. He filed a fuel emergency with the Gorath station and rerouted to the secondary depot at Veln Point, which was technically in a different registry zone. He filed 3 separate paperwork queries about zone transfer procedures, each one requiring a response from the Keth Moral before the inspection could be legally transferred to another vessel. He knew the system. He had spent 6 years enforcing it as a colonial ranger, which meant he had also spent 6 years watching people work around it. He bought himself 12 more days. At night, when the ship was quiet and the nav console light was the only thing on, Rail sat in the cargo hold with Thorn and Sable. Thorn slept hard, all at once, the way young things did, completely committed to unconsciousness. Sable did not always sleep right away. Sometimes it sat near Rail and watched the dark, and Rail found himself talking, not to anyone in particular, just in the way of a man who had been alone too long. He talked about the salvage routes. He talked about the Gorath station and the fuel prices. He talked about the weather on his home colony, which had real weather, which most Outer Rim stations did not. He talked about the Ranger years, a little. He talked about nothing important. And on the 39th night, Sable opened its mouth and made a sound that was not a cry and was not a growl, but was something that sat in the space between shaped, deliberate, pointed directly at Rail. He stopped talking. Sable did it again. It was not a word in any language Rail spoke, but the intention behind it was clear as anything he had ever heard. It meant, "I hear you, I am here, keep going." He sat with that for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, to both of them, to Thorn asleep and to Sable watching, "I'm not letting them have you." He had not meant to say it out loud. He had been thinking it since the first day. It felt different spoken. It felt like something he could not take back, which was fine, because he had not planned to. He did not know yet what it would cost, but he had said it, and Sable had heard it, and that was enough for one night. Outside, the Keth moral was still out there somewhere, patient and official, and certain that the human would eventually run out of paperwork. Rail pulled up a new filing, a dispute over zone jurisdiction between two conclave registry divisions that he had technically been able to initiate for the last 6 years and had never needed to until now. He filed it at midnight in the dark while a dragon watched over his shoulder. He figured he had maybe 2 more weeks. He would need to think of something better before then. The name Nora Vass appeared in Rail's ComQ like something he had buried on purpose and dug up by accident. He had not contacted her. She had found him, which meant someone had told her to look, which meant the scatter still had eyes on the outer rim lanes, which meant at least some things had not changed in the years since he had last needed to know. The message was short, in the clipped style she had always used. "Heard you're having an interesting season, don't file anything else. Come to the Veln secondary depot and dock in Bay 14. Come alone, already know you can't." That last line meant she knew about Thorn and Sable. He went. Nora Vass was leaning against a support strut in Bay 14 when he arrived, arms crossed, watching the dumb luck settle into the dock, with the kind of critical look she gave most things by default. She was a small woman, compact, sharp-eyed, with grey starting at her temples that had not been there the last time he had seen her. She had the look of someone who had survived a great many situations by being the person in the room who was paying the most attention. She looked at Thorn and Sable, who came down the ramp behind Rail before he could stop them. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Well." "Yeah," Rail said. "How long?" 3 months and change." She looked at him. "You've been flying these lanes for 3 months with 2 Drakvan hatchlings in your cargo hold. 4 months now, roughly. And filing conclave paperwork to stay ahead of an inspection vessel. I had some free time." She shook her head, but not in a way that meant she was walking away. It was the head shake she used for things that were complicated and not going to become simpler no matter how long you looked at them. Then she got down on one knee, which he had not expected, and she looked at Sable directly, eye level, not looming. Sable looked back. Neither of them moved for a long moment. "Smart eyes," Nora said quietly. "The small one will bite you if you reach for it," Rail said. "Good," she said, and stood back up. She had a secure comm set up in the back of Bay 14, a full encryption rig, the kind the scatter had been using since before Rail had known them. She sat him down. Made a drink he didn't ask for and took for himself anyway, and started making connections. What came through on the other end of those connections was something Rail had not expected. The first call was to Colony Moon far along the outer rim, a quiet place where a man named Doss ran a medical supply depot that was, officially, just a medical supply depot. He was a grey-haired, soft-spoken man who had spent 20 years as a field medic for the Colonial Authority before retiring to the rim with a collection of useful equipment and no particular interest in being told what to do. He came on the comm and looked at Rail for a moment. Then he turned the feed slightly, and in the background of his depot, tucked into a reinforced room that looked like it had been a storage space once and had been carefully converted into something else, there was a Drakvan, not a hatchling, an adolescent, close to juvenile stage, large enough that its wings brushed the ceiling when it shifted. It was looking at the comm screen with the same kind of still, watching intelligence that Sable had. "Found her 5 years ago," Doss said. "Edge of the Selrath debris field. Her colony ship had been hit. She was the only one left." Nobody said anything for a moment. The second call was to a deep rock mining station in the belt system at the outer edge of Vorin space. The man who answered called himself Grint, and he was the kind of old that came from decades of hard physical work rather than age alone. He had a miner's hands and a miner's directness, and he did not waste time on explanations once he understood who he was talking to. "I've got three," he said. "Two brothers and a sister, if the Drakvain have those. Found the brothers in a derelict transport about 8 years back. The third one just turned up at my station 2 years ago, walked up to the airlock and waited. I figured she knew something I didn't." He shrugged. "They live in the lower tunnels. Conclave survey teams come through once a year and scan for mineral content. I file the same report every time and nobody looks below level 9. The third call was a woman named Sira. She had a calm face and a voice that did not rise or fall much, which gave everything she said a kind of flatness that was harder to listen to than anger would have been. She had been a clerk in the Conclave Administrative Office on Vorin Station 12 years ago. She had processed the documentation when the last confirmed adult Drakvain in Conclave custody had been quietly reclassified as a biological asset and transferred to a research facility. She had filed the paperwork. She had gone home that night and not slept. 2 weeks later, she had submitted her resignation and boarded a transport to the Outer Rim and never gone back. "I don't have any with me," she said. "What I have is documentation, records, the real ones, not the official versions, what the poaching networks looked like, who funded them, which conclave divisions knew and filed silence reports. I have all of it." She looked at Rail through the screen. "I have been waiting for a reason to use it." Rail sat in Bay 14 and looked at the three faces on the comm screen, and then at Nora, who was watching him with that careful look she used when she wanted to know what he was going to do next without asking. These were not soldiers. They were not activists or rebels or people who had set out to save something. They were a medic who could not walk past a hurt creature, a miner who had let something into his tunnels because it waited at his airlock and trusted him, and a woman who had done her job correctly and then could not forget it. None of them had known about the others. None of them had planned it. They had each just made one decision, alone, and then kept making it again every day. He thought about what that meant. He thought about the kind of thing you could not really organize or train for or build a policy around, the specific way that humans tripped over something that needed to be done, and then simply could not stop doing it. Thorn was trying to gnaw on the leg of the comm table. Sable was sitting beside Rail, perfectly still, watching the faces on the screen with an attention that felt, even now, like more than instinct. Rail said, "We need a plan." Nora said, "We need more than a plan. We need somewhere they can exist without hiding." "That might not exist yet," Doss said. "Then we find somewhere and we make it exist," Grint said, in the tone of a man who had spent 40 years making things exist in places that had not had them before. Sira was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Before any of that, someone needs to be loud enough that the conclave cannot be quiet anymore. The paperwork I have is only useful if someone forces it into the open." Everyone looked at Rail. He had not said he would do it. He had not agreed to anything beyond docking in Bay 14 and coming alone, mostly. But he understood, in the way that he usually understood things when they had already been decided by events rather than by him, that the direction was set. He was already the one the Keth Moral was following. He might as well be useful about it. He looked at Sable, who had heard him talk every night for 4 months. Sable, whose first deliberate sound had been shaped to mean "I hear you." Sable, who was sitting beside him right now at a planning table, watching the future being arranged. "All right," Rail said, "tell me what you need." Nora pulled out a physical map, old habit. She had always said digital could be read by the wrong people, and spread it on the table, and they began. Outside Bay 14, the Keth Moral was still somewhere in the region, still patient, still official, still certain that eventually the human would run out of room to move. None of them were thinking about what happened when humans ran out of room to move. That was always the mistake. The Verath Drift was where things went when they had nowhere else to go. It was a debris corridor, a long, slow river of broken rock and derelict metal that ran along the outermost edge of conclave-mapped space, technically claimed by no administrative division, practically ignored by all of them. Ships that did not want to be found had been hiding in the Verath Drift for 2 centuries. The sensor scatter from all the floating debris made detailed scans unreliable. The Conclave considered it a navigation hazard and suggested in their official charts that vessels avoid it. The scatter used it as a meeting point for exactly this reason. Rail brought the dumb luck in through the narrow approach, matching drift speed with the larger rocks, and found the others where Nora had said they would be. DOS's small medic runner tucked behind a flat slab of asteroid, Grint's mining hauler sitting low and dark with its transponder off, and a slim, older model transport he did not recognize that turned out to belong to Sierra. 4 ships and 2 dragons, and one plan that Nora had insisted on calling a start rather than a plan, because plans implied things were under control. Things were not under control. The Keth Moral had not come alone this time. Rail saw the enforcement fleet on the edge of his long-range scanner the moment he finished docking alignment. 3 mid-class conclave enforcement vessels, not inspector ships but actual enforcement, the kind that carried security detachments and were authorized to board and detain without the same procedural requirements he had been using to stall. They were holding at the entry corridor of the drift, not entering yet, but present, waiting. Someone had talked, he did not know who, and it did not matter now. He got on the secure channel to the others. They're here. We see them, Nora said, her voice even. How long before they come in? DOS asked. They won't come into the drift at speed without knowing our position, Rail said. The sensor scatter works for us too, but they'll start a slow sweep. We've got 2, maybe 3 hours before they're close enough for a hard scan to get through the interference. Then we run, Grint said. To where? Sierra said quietly. There is nowhere to run that they won't follow. They know who we are now, all of us. Running just means they pick us up one at a time instead of all at once. Silence on the channel. Rail was not looking at the scanner. He was looking at Thorn and Sable. Thorn was moving around the cargo hold with the restless energy it always had when it could feel that something was wrong. Sable was still. Sable was watching Rail the way it always did when it was waiting for him to decide something. He had been thinking about what Sierra said weeks ago, that someone needed to be loud enough that the conclave could not be quiet anymore. He had been turning it over the whole time, looking for a different answer, and not finding one. He said, I'm going to broadcast. The channel was very quiet. Nora said, say that again. Open channel, galactic-wide relay, everything, what was in that poached hauler, what their mother did, how long DOS and Grint and Sierra have been doing this, what the Conclave's extinction filing actually covered up, all of it live. Rail, Nora said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite fear but was close to it. If you do that, you can't undo it. I know. They'll still come after us. They'll come after us if we don't. This way, they have to do it in front of everyone. Another silence, longer this time. Grint said, do it. DOS said, do it. Sierra said, I have been waiting 12 years for someone to do it. Do it. Nora did not say anything for a moment. Then, you're going to want to not be wearing your work gloves. You look less trustworthy in the work gloves. He took the work gloves off. He set up the broadcast from the dumb Lux comm system, which was not a broadcast rig by any standard. It was a salvage hauler's standard unit with a signal booster he had installed 3 years ago for finding distress beacons in deep debris fields. Nora ran a relay patch through her own ship system to amplify it further. It would reach the galactic-wide comm grid. It would carry. He opened the feed and looked into the small camera mounted above the console. He did not have a speech. He had not written anything down. He was not a speaker. He had been a ranger and then a salvage operator, and the only audiences he had addressed were customs officials and the occasional very stupid pirate. He looked into the camera for a moment and thought about the dead hauler in the Vorath system, and the stripped scales on the floor, and the thermal pod blinking red, and the sound he had heard through a vacuum and a sealed door and 2 inches of insulated suit. He started talking. He said his name, He said his registration number. He said where he was, approximately. He said what he had found 4 months ago in a burned hauler in the Vorath system, and he described it plainly, not dramatically, just what it was. A ship, a dead mother, 2 alive young ones, a thermal pod with 10 minutes left. He said what he had done and why. Because they were crying, he said, and I could hear them. He talked about the Drakvain, what they were, what had happened to them, what the Conclave's extinction filing looked like on paper versus what it had covered. He named the poaching networks, drawing on Sierra's documentation, which she was transmitting to him in text form as he spoke, and which he read from directly. He named the Conclave divisions that had filed silence reports. He named the research facility that had received the last known living adult in Conclave custody. He said that he was not the only human who had done this. He named Dos and Grint and Sierra, and he named what each of them had done, and he said clearly that he was naming them himself so that they could not be quietly disappeared one by one, because disappearing people quietly was easier when nobody knew their names. He was not angry when he said it. He was not performing. He was the same even, dry, slightly tired voice he used for everything. He had been talking for about 9 minutes when Thorn walked into the frame. He had not planned that. Thorn simply came up the cargo hold steps, pushed through the door that was not latched all the way, and walked directly in front of the camera and stopped. It stood there and looked into the lens with the flat, direct confidence of something that had never been told to be afraid of being seen. Rael did not stop talking. And then Sable came. Sable moved past Rael's side with that slow deliberateness it always had, and it did not stand in front of the camera. It put one clawed hand, carefully, with no violence, on Rael's shoulder, and it stayed there. He felt that, through his jacket, he kept talking. He finished by saying what he thought needed to be said, which was not complicated and did not take long. He said the Conclave had decided these creatures did not need to exist anymore, and that he disagreed, and that the people who had helped him disagreed, and that the fact that none of them had known about each other until now and had all made the same decision separately seemed to him like the kind of thing that meant something. "We are not asking permission," he said. "We are telling you what we did. You can do what you like with that." He closed the feed. The Kethmoral and its fleet were still out there on the scanner. They had not moved. He could imagine the comm traffic happening on those ships right now, the reporting upward, the calls to the Conclave High Council, the sudden awareness that 3 enforcement vessels were hovering at the edge of a debris field, while a live galactic broadcast made their presence a very visible thing. Nora's voice came on the channel, quieter than usual. "High Council comm traffic is spiking. They're telling the fleet to hold position." "Good," Rael said. "You're trending on the galactic relay," Sierra said, and she sounded, for the first time he could remember, like she might almost smile. He sat down. His hands were shaking, which he had expected. He pressed them flat on his knees until they stopped. He reached for a cup of something that had gone cold an hour ago and drank it anyway. Thorn walked back out of the cockpit, already bored. Sable stayed a little longer. It looked at Rael with those amber eyes, and Rael looked back, and then it turned and went back into the cargo hold and curled up, apparently satisfied with how the last 11 minutes had gone. Administrator Solus, Rael learned later, had been on a comm call with 3 different Conclave Council members at the moment of the broadcast. He had reportedly said nothing for a full minute when it was shown to him. Then he had said, "Why do they always do this?" Nobody on the call had a good answer for him. They never did. The summons came 6 days after the broadcast, and it was not an arrest warrant. Rael had been expecting an arrest warrant. He had talked through what that would look like with Nora and with Sierra, who knew Conclave legal procedure better than anyone. He had prepared a response. He had been ready to be difficult about it in a very official and time-consuming way. Instead, the message carried the seal of the Conclave High Assembly itself, not the administrative division, not the registry office, not enforcement. The High Assembly, which was the governing body of the entire galactic conclave, composed of representatives from every member species, some of whom had been sitting in their seats for longer than human civilization had been writing things down. The message said that Rail Dern, salvage operator, registry number on file, was requested to appear before the High Assembly at Conclave Central Station within 14 days to speak on the matter of the Drakvin species and the circumstances outlined in his recent public transmission. It said requested, not required. That was deliberate, and he knew it. They could not require it without framing this as a criminal proceeding, and they had looked at the galactic relay numbers from his broadcast and decided they did not want to frame it as a criminal proceeding. He went. He brought Thorn and Sable. Nobody in the summons had told him not to, and he had decided that if no one specifically said the dragons could not come, he would proceed as though they were invited. Conclave Central Station was the kind of place built to make you feel the weight of what it represented. It hung in open space between 4 star systems, enormous and symmetrical, its architecture a combination of every member species styles layered over centuries until it had become something that belonged to no one and everyone. The docking bays alone were larger than most colonies Rail had worked near. The corridors went on so long that they had internal transit systems. He walked through it in his salvage jacket. He had considered wearing something else. He had decided against it on the grounds that wearing something else would imply he felt he needed to look different than he was, and he did not. Nora had found him a small room to clean up in, and that was enough. The High Assembly Chamber was a circular room with tiered seating that rose up and around in a full ring, each section holding the delegation of a member species. There were 47 member species in the Galactic Conclave. Some of the delegations were 1 representative, some were 12. Most of them had been watching his broadcast. The room was built for beings of many different sizes, shapes, and atmospheric preferences, and it accommodated all of them with the practiced efficiency of a place that had been doing this for a very long time. Rail was given a floor position at the center of the circle, the speaking point, with a standard translation unit clipped to his collar and a small table he did not sit at. He stood. Thorn and Sable stood beside him. The silence in the room when they entered was the loudest silence Rail had ever heard. Not hostile, not welcoming. The silence of a very large number of very old civilizations looking at something they had not expected and adjusting their understanding of the moment. The assembly speaker, a tall Vorin elder whose title translated roughly to chair of proceedings, opened formally. There were protocols. There were acknowledgements of the parties present. There was a reading of the relevant conclave statutes, which took a while. Rail waited. Thorn sat down on the floor with the specific lack of ceremony it applied to most things. Sable stood. Then Rail was given 12 minutes to speak. He had thought about those 12 minutes on the long transit to Central Station. He had not written a speech. He had tried once on the second day of travel, and what he had written had looked wrong to him when he read it back, too arranged, too careful. He had deleted it. He looked around the chamber. He looked at the 47 delegations, at species he recognized and species he did not, at beings who had governed star systems when humans were still figuring out agriculture. He thought about what they needed to hear. He started with the dead hauler. He described it the same way he had in the broadcast, but slower, with more detail, because he was here in person and he wanted it to be real to them rather than a transmission. He talked about the stripped scales on the floor. He talked about the thermal pod. He talked about what the power indicator showed when he cut the door open. He said she locked them inside from the wrong side of the door. She reached through the manual release from outside and pulled it shut. She stayed out there so they would have every bit of warmth the pod held. He let that sit for a moment. I don't know how long she lived after that. I don't know what she thought about in that time. I know what she did, and I know why, because there is only one reason a mother does that. He talked about Dos and Grint and Sierra. He told their stories again here in person because he wanted these 47 delegations to understand that none of it had been organized. There had been no movement, no plan, no network before now, just separate humans in separate places making the same decision without knowing anyone else was making it. We are not the oldest species, he said. We have been in space for what your records probably describe as a short time. We are not the most powerful, or the wisest, or the most advanced. I'm not here to argue that we are any of those things." He paused. "But we stop. When something is in trouble and we can hear it, we stop. We have been doing it since before we knew what stars were. It is not a policy. It is not a strategy. It is just what we do, and we do it whether anyone is watching or not, which is why 4 people who were doing the same thing didn't find each other for years." He looked around the chamber slowly. "You classified these creatures as extinct and filed it away. I understand why. The process was clean and the outcome was certain, and it was more comfortable than the alternative. But comfort is not the same as right, and a file marked closed is not the same as something being over." He said the last part plainly, without emphasis, because it didn't need any. "I am asking this assembly to open the file back up." 12 minutes, he sat down after 11 and a half. What happened next was not a speech by anyone. It was the sound of 47 delegations doing something that translated, in the Assembly's official record, as extended deliberative response, which in practice meant a large number of very old civilizations processing something that had not fit neatly into the frameworks they had been using. And then Thorn stood up. Rail had not seen it coming. Thorn was not a creature that did formal things. Thorn bit salvage netting and stole food and knocked things over and slept like it was falling rather than resting. But Thorn stood up from the floor of the high assembly chamber of the Galactic Conclave, and it raised its head and it let out a sound. Not a cry, not a growl. The translators caught the shape of it and processed it, and the readout that appeared on the assembly speaker's display said, "Drakvain formal greeting, classification, address between equals, last recorded use 304 years ago." The chamber went completely still. Sable beside Rail turned its head and made the same sound. Slower, lower, more deliberate. 300 years of silence, and the sound had come back in a conclave chamber, directed at the 47 species that had let the silence happen. The assembly speaker was quiet for a very long time. The vote was not unanimous. 3 elder councillors voted against, including the oldest member of the assembly, who had been sitting in that chamber for 9,000 years and had seen species come and go and had long since made a kind of peace with the idea that some things ended. He was heard to say afterward that he had not been prepared for a human to show up in a salvage jacket with 2 young dragons and 11 and a half minutes of plain words. He had not meant it as a compliment. But the vote passed. A provisional Drakvain protected status was authorized. A working group was formed to identify a sanctuary world. 3 member species, the Deln, the Ruvari, and the Ossoth, who had been moved in ways their representatives had not fully expected to be moved, offered resources and territorial access for the process. Rail walked out of the high assembly chamber with Thorn and Sable, through the long corridors of Conclave Central Station, and found an empty side corridor with a bench, and sat on it. He was not a man who processed things outwardly. He sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor and breathed. Sable came and sat beside him, close, not touching him, but close enough that he could feel its warmth. Thorn found something near the corridor wall that interested it and went to investigate. He sat there for a long time. Eventually he said, to nobody in particular, "All right." And then he got up, and they went to find Nora, who had been watching the assembly feed from a public terminal and who did not say anything when she saw him, just handed him a drink that was thankfully warm this time. They had a lot of work left to do. But the file was open again. That was the part that mattered. The planet did not have a name yet. It had a designation number in the Conclave Survey Registry, a string of letters and digits that told you its orbital position, its atmospheric composition, its resource index, and its distance from the nearest mapped relay point. None of that was a name. A name was something given by people who intended to stay, and that process had only just begun. It was a good world. Rail could see that plainly from the moment the dumb luck broke through the upper cloud layer and the ground came into view below. Wide plains covered in long grass that moved in slow ripples when the wind crossed it. Mountain ranges along the eastern continent with peaks high enough to catch the clouds. Forests dense and dark green. Rivers that caught the sun in long bright lines across the lowlands. The air was breathable, not comfortable by every standard, but breathable, and the atmospheric analysis showed it would suit the Drakven well. Warm enough at the equator, open enough everywhere. Big enough. That was the word Rail kept coming back to. It was big enough. 2 years had passed since the Verath drift, and the broadcast, and the High Assembly chamber, and the vote that had passed with 3 people voting against and 44 in favor. 2 years of negotiations that Sira had largely handled, because she knew the Conclave's systems better than anyone and could argue procedural points for longer than most species were willing to continue a conversation. 2 years of the scatter running supply lines. 2 years of DOS quietly locating surviving Drakven, which turned out to be harder than finding them and easier than everyone had feared. Because once the word was out, the ones who were hiding began, slowly and cautiously, to stop hiding. 15, that was the count. 15 surviving Drakven, scattered across a dozen systems, living in tunnels and depots and sealed rooms and the occasional derelict ship. Kept alive by the specific and unreasonable stubbornness of people who had found them and could not walk away. They were all coming here. Thorn and Sable were first. Rail brought the dumb luck down to a flat stretch of open ground near the edge of one of the Great Plains, and he set it down as gently as he had ever set anything down, and he lowered the ramp. Thorn went down the ramp at a speed that was only technically still walking, hit the grass, and immediately started running. Not away, not in any particular direction, just running, because there was space, and it had never had this much space before, and it met that fact the way it met most facts, with direct physical enthusiasm. Its wings spread partway, not fully, not yet, and its feet hit the ground with a sound that Rail could hear from the top of the ramp, solid and real. Sable walked down slowly. It always moved this way now, not slowly from caution, but with a deliberateness that had become more pronounced as it grew older and larger, as though each step was a considered thing. It reached the grass and stopped. It lowered its head and touched the grass with its nose, very gently, and then it stood upright and looked out across the plain. Rail came down the ramp behind it. Doss's ship was already on the ground 50 meters away. Grint's hauler was coming down through the cloud layer, big and unhurried. Nora's vessel had landed first. She had scouted the landing site the day before because she was Nora. Sira stood near her transport with a handheld scanner and the expression of a person doing an official task very carefully to keep from showing how she actually felt about it. Grint came down his ramp with the 3 adolescent Drakvine behind him, big now, bigger than anything Rail had expected when he had first heard about them. Their scales bright and their movements full of a power that was still contained, but would not be contained forever. They stepped onto the grass and went still for a moment, the 3 of them, and then they made a sound together, low, layered, resonant, that Rail felt in his chest rather than heard with his ears. From inside Doss's ship, the adolescent female came out alone and stood at the top of the ramp, and she looked at the world below her for a long moment before she came down. Thorn was still running somewhere out in the grass. You could see the trail it was cutting through the long stems. Sable turned and looked at Rail. This was the moment he had been not thinking about for a long time. Not avoiding, exactly. He was not a man who avoided things, but not looking directly at either. He had known it was coming. He had known from somewhere in the early weeks that this was where the line ran, his part and what came after his part, and the space between them where he had to decide how to stand. He did not belong here. He was glad the place existed. He was glad he had not kept flying that day in the Vorath system. He would do it again without thinking. But this world was not his, and the work ahead of it was not his to do, and the life that would grow here was not something he could be the center of without making himself larger than he was, which he had never been interested in doing. Sable said his name. It said it the way it had learned language, carefully, from the inside, with the precision of something that understood words as containers for meaning rather than sounds to be copied. It said his name and it looked at him, and then it did something Rail had never seen it do before. It lowered its head, not the way an animal did when it was resting or afraid, the way a person did when they were giving weight to a moment. Then it spoke. It was not in any language Rail knew well enough to follow, and the translation unit he had was not built for formal Drakven address, which was an old form and not commonly found in translation databases. What he caught was partial, pieces of meaning rather than full sentences, but he caught enough. Something about being found when being lost was the same thing as being ended. Something about the difference between a witness and a participant, and why that difference did not exist the way people assumed it did. Something about the carrying of a weight not asked for, which was a different thing entirely from a weight accepted, and what a person became by accepting one. He stood in the grass of a world without a name yet, and listened to a dragon tell him what he had done in the language its people had used since, before his species had existed, and he did not understand all of it, and he understood enough. He did not cry, he came close. He stood there with his jaw tight and his hands still and let the words finish, and then he nodded. "All right," he said, the same word he always said when something was settled. He looked out at the plain. Thorn was coming back, finally, grass-stained and at a slightly slower speed. Grint was sitting on the ramp of his hauler with his big miner's hands on his knees, watching the Drakven on the grass with an expression that had nothing defensive in it at all. Doss was talking quietly with Sira. Nora was standing by herself a little distance away, looking at the mountains to the east. Rail went back up the ramp of the dumb luck. He did not rush. He checked the ship systems, filed a departure clearance with the relay point, made sure the supply load he had brought, food stock for the first month, building materials, 2 crates of medical supplies from Doss's stock, had all been unloaded properly. He checked that Thorn had not left anything important half-chewed in the cargo hold. Nora came up the ramp before he finished. "So what now?" she said. "Salvage run," he said. "Heard there's a wrecked freighter near the Delnoth belt. Could be good metal." She looked at him for a moment. "You just helped save a species." "Thorn bit a hole in my cargo net, and I don't have a spare," he said. "I need the money." She almost smiled. Not quite. She put a hand on his shoulder briefly, the same shoulder Sable had rested its claw on during the broadcast, and then she went back down the ramp. He finished his checks. He sealed the cargo hold. He went up to the cockpit, pulled out his bunk, and then didn't lie down, just stood at the viewport for a minute. On the plain below, Sable was standing where he had left it, watching the dumb luck. Around it, the other Drakven were beginning to move out into the world. Slowly, still carefully, the way things moved when they had been careful for a very long time and were only just beginning to understand that they did not have to be anymore. Thorn had found something in the grass and was very interested in it. He watched until the dumb luck lifted and the plane got smaller and the wide green world pulled back to show its coasts and clouds, and then he turned away from the viewport and plotted his course for the Delnoth belt. He had a ship to run and a net to replace and fuel costs that did not care about any of this. 2 weeks later, a conclave administrative officer updated the official species registry. The entry for the Drakven was changed from the classification it had held for 230 years. It had said, "Extinct, file closed." It said now, "Recovering, file open." In the notes field, the officer had entered the cause of the status change as required by registry protocol. She had written, "Human interference." She had not meant it as a compliment. She had been thinking about it ever since.